although most imagined drug networks existing on the fringes of society. In reality, the massive amounts of capital that result from the production and distribution of illicit drugs occupy a central place within the global economic system. Consider a statement made in 2009 by Antonio Maria Costa, who was then the head of the UN Office on Drugs. According to Costa, proceeds from the drug trade were an important source of liquidity for cash-starved banks at the height of the 2008 economic crisis. The amounts absorbed by the banking system were enough to prevent some banks from collapsing. Interbank loans were funded by money that originated from the drug trade and other illegal activities. There were signs that some banks were rescued that way. In 2000, Le Monde Diplomatique suggested that the global drug trade was $1 billion a year business. An incredibly low estimate. 17 years later, the Global Financial Integrity Project estimated that worldwide drug trafficking revenue stood somewhere between $426 to $652 billion annually. In the same report, the overall revenue of illicit activities was posited to be $2.2 trillion. The UN Office on Drugs and Crime, meanwhile, estimated that money laundering activities encompassing the washing of illicit drug revenue and more make up anywhere from 2 to 5% of global GDP. At around $800 billion to $2 trillion, this again is almost certainly a conservative estimate. In 2012, $21 to $32 trillion was estimated to be slashing through the offshore banking system. This number would have only increased in the wake of the earlier 2000. When such immense sums of money are being generated, it isn't left to idle in bank accounts in the Cayman, Bermuda, the City of London, or wherever the end destination of a money-washing process. To transform dirty money into seemingly clean investment capital. Journalist Michael Rupert, in his book Crossing the Rubicon, cites cases where companies have tapped illicit money flows in order to borrow money at a lower interest rate than they would receive from major banking institutions. The conversion of dirty or hot money into credit capital that begins as a line of credit issued by a lending institution is made easier by banks and tax havens, which makes it possible for legitimate and illegitimate pools of capital to intermingle freely. Catherine Austin Fitts and Chris Sanders have gone even further by suggesting that there is a positive correlation between the upwards trajectory of stock market performance and the consistent ballooning of the drug trade. While there are a number of factors that impact stock market performance, such as easy money injected into the economy by the central banks of various countries, Fitts and Sanders write that it may seem strange to think of a positive correlation between narcotics trafficking and the market, but consider the proceeds of crime need to find a way into legitimate, that is, legal channels, or they are worthless to the holders. If one further imagines that the banking system earns a fee of 1% for handling this flow, rather low, considering that money laundering is a seller's market, then the profits for banks from this activity are of the order of $5 to $10 billion. Applying Citigroup's current stock market multiple of 15 or so to this yields a market capitalization of anywhere from $65 to $115 billion. One can thus readily see the importance of the illegal drug trade to the financial services industry. Another tactic for washing money is the capital into real estate operations that Naylor referred to in relation to KMT drug money flows in Florida. Indeed, it seems that the explosive growth of the world economy in the decades following World War II opened up countless investment opportunities where the funds from drugs and other sources of capital for organized crime would be sucked away. It was this period, after all, that saw the great ballooning of real estate markets and the high-tech industry, along with the modern tourism industry that spawned everything from destination resorts and exotic locales to the sparkling lights of Las Vegas casinos. In his book Power Shift, Kirkpatrick Sale argues that the post-war era was characterized by a rising southern rim that came to confront the traditional seat of American economic and political power in the Northeast. The southern rim was made of the southern states' portions of the Midwest and the Sunbelt, a large expanse that stretched from Florida to California. The rim's ascendancy, he argues, was connected to the opening up of vast real estate opportunities related in part to tourism and retirement, to the oil and gas industries, and to the delirious growth of defense-related industries under the new Cold War. Sales suggests that organized crime, so often associated with the American Northeast, found a remarkable range of new opportunities in the southern rim, thus propelling these networks to previously inconceivable heights of power and influence. The blossoming trade of opium and heroin, clearly spurred and protected by the CIA, fits snugly into these series of developments. Sale right? Smuggling, especially of heroin, in which the trade grew steadily more lucrative after the opening up of Asia's Golden Triangle in 1948, tilted to the south, taking advantage of the enormous rim coastline and the porous Mexican border, along which whole networks of Latin connections and Mexican connections were developed, and everywhere in the booming rim millions of dollars are placed in legitimate investments, chiefly in those high-risk operations where venture capital is hard to come by: oil exploration, sample and land speculation, and in those large-scale businesses where sizable amounts of capital are necessary: corporate farming, for example, technological manufacturing, and above all real estate development. The observations and arguments made by Kirkpatrick Sale, Michael Rupert and Catherine Austin Fitz neatly dovetail with the complicated, yet organized history detailed by Gus Russo in his book Super Mob. The term super mob, per Russo, refers to a close-knit circle of Jewish and Italian mobsters and businessmen who arose in the corruption-ridden corridors of Chicago and who then installed themselves in California and elsewhere. What makes the super mob unique is that it was a particularly stark and fairly unmasked example of how criminal networks, political power and legitimate commercial activity mixed together in the period of explosive economic and cultural growth in the wake of World War II. A key player in this group was Jake Avery, who started off as a political fixer in Chicago's 24th Ward. He acted as a precinct captain and managed to swing the dominant political orientation of the ward from the Republican to the Democratic Party. He was later praised by Franklin D. Roosevelt for his efforts to make his district the best Democratic ward in the country by 1928. Avery was the ward chairman and the budding associate of organized crime. He forged an alliance with the gangster Al Capone, and the two worked together to elevate Anton Cermak to the mayor's office. On the business side of things, one of Avery's closest associates was Henry Crown, who later became a major figure in the Hilton Hotel Company. The dominant controlling interest in the major defense contractor General Dynamics and the owner of the Empire State Building. He subsequently sold the iconic building to Lawrence Wine, a New York City lawyer and real estate developer who was helping manage the assets of the Desert Inn in Las Vegas, which was controlled by mobster Mo Dalitz and, as will be noted in Chapter 4, tied up with the affairs of the infamous lawyer Roy Cohn. Crown was also in business with David G. Baird, who ran a trio of foundations closely tied to organized crime, and that moved CIA money. David Baird and his foundations will also be discussed in Chapter 4. Crown's son Lester will later join the Mega Group, which was co-founded by Leslie Wexner and Charles Brownsman in 1991 and is discussed in detail in Chapter 4. Henry Crown's business empire first began with his company, Material Services Corporation, a supplier of concrete and other materials for construction companies during World War II. Crown took leave from material service to serve in the Army Corps of Engineers during this same period. The company benefited greatly from Crown's relationship with Jake Avery as Russo. Writes Avery, who had also joined the armed services, managed to become, with no small thanks to friends in the Roosevelt administration, the overseer of countless international post-exchange PX. On military bases, soon the military was supplying these PXs with goods purchased from Buddy Colonel Crown's Material Service Corporation. In 1959, Material Services Corporation merged with General Dynamics, which at the time was a producer of bomber aircraft, ballistic missile systems and other cutting-edge technologies for the America. Military Crown received 20% equity in the company, making him the controlling stakeholder, and his right-hand man, Patrick Hoyt, was installed as vice president of the corporation. Had earlier been president of the Hotel Sherman in Chicago, popular watering hole for various denizens of the city's organized crime community, since General Dynamics' board was populated by a cross-section of individuals tied to the Cold War military and intelligence structures. This chain of ownership and associates is a surprisingly straightforward instance of mutual collusion between these spheres and the criminal underworld. In 1966, after leaving General Dynamics, Huawei became vice chairman of the Penn-Dixie Cement Company, the CEO of which, Jerome Castle, was an admitted old friend of New York crime boss Frank Costello. Avery, Crown and Hoy were all close to an important Chicago lawyer named Sidney Korshak. The Korshak family had grown up with the Averys, and just like Jake Avery, Sidney Korshak forged an early working relationship with. Even before he was officially an attorney, Korshak's side gig while he was in law school had been to act as an advisor to the infamous gangster. His subsequent law partner, Edward King, was the lawyer for Capone's heir, Frank Nitti. Before setting off for greener pastures in New York, where he worked for Meyer Lansky himself. Lansky and Korshak also did business together. As partners in the Acapulco Towers Hotel, notably the magazine, New West stated in 1976 that Korshak was the logical successor to Meyer Lansky. Like Crown's business associate, Lawrence Wine, Korshak had ties to mob syrup modalities and circles, according to Russo. Korshak lent his considerable legal talents to helping arrange frontmen for organized crime interests in Las Vegas hotels and casinos. The Hoods, he writes, needed owners of record whose IRS statements reflected legitimate wealth. The obvious first choice was Modulus Delete's his criminal background, and his webs of associations will be discussed mainly in Chapter. Another associate of the supermob was Julius Caesar Stein, an ophthalmologist and musician that abandoned his medical career to book dance bands and singers into speakeasies and nightclubs on Chicago's South Side. In 1924, he founded the Music Corporation of America, MCA, as an umbrella company for his booking efforts. Reportedly, Al Capone owned a secret case of the company. While this cannot be confirmed, it is true that Capone and Stein had a cozy relationship with the gangster, ensuring that Chicago's bars, clubs, and music halls directed their business towards dine-in In 1936, Stein brought a man into the MCA fold who would go on to fundamentally shape the character and direction of the American entertainment industry forever. Lou Wasserman. Unsurprisingly, Wasserman already boasted a background in mob circles. He had been the publicist for Cleveland, Ohio's Mayfair Casino, which was controlled by Modelus's network. Dalitz and Wasserman maintained lifelong ties. Wasserman would even marry Edith Beckerman, the daughter of Dalitz's lawyer Henry Beck. Wasserman knew Beckerman from his days at the Mayfair Casino. Ackerman's name was listed on the club's liquor license, and Wasserman's and MC's connections to organized crime are discussed in greater detail in chapters 9 and 10. Soon the Chicago mob began its slow creep into Los Angeles, moving into Hollywood and adjacent industries. The man who started off their advance was Johnny Roselli, who would later land in Las Vegas as the Chicago mob's frontman in the casino business. He was placed in charge of skimming operations, which, as will be discussed in Chapter 3, moved money into offshore banks in the Caribbean that were themselves controlled by representatives of Meyer Lansky. Perhaps it was his intimate familiarity with this world that helped Roselli become the CIA's mafiosi of choice when it came to recruiting organized crime figures for its covert assassination. Lots against Fidel Castro in Cuba. Through the operations that took shape in California, massive amounts of illicit money began to be dumped into above-board industries. Real estate was a particularly hot commodity, and the architect of many of the investments made by the supermob was a protégé of Avery and Korshik named Paul Ziffren. Ziffren's granddaughter would later marry Lou Wasserman's grandson. Later, bringing these families even closer together, Ziffren acted as the LA representative of Hilton Hotel interests, and he was the source of the seed capital that launched Store Properties Inc., a real estate holding company whose ostensible owner was a man named Sam Gina. Genius was most likely a conduit for enabling the flow of organized crime money into real estate. For Russo, Genius was a known associate of mob bosses Longy's Wilman Dox Thatcher, Frank Costello, Joey Adonis and Meyer Lansky. Genius's criminal records showed that he had been arrested for bad checks in Florida and embezzlement in New York, and mail fraud and securities law violations in Georgia. By 1957, Stored Properties had bought thousands of acres of land and over 300 transactions worth $20 million in Los Angeles alone. When Store's other California purchases are factored in. In San Bernardino, Fresno, Oakland and San Francisco, the estimate approaches $100 million. Then there were the additional investments in such states as Arizona, Utah, Colorado, Oklahoma, Florida, Illinois and Genius, interestingly, was the member of an organized circle of businessmen who helped provide the startup capital for the Committee on the Present Danger. CPD, an early Cold War pressure group set up to build public support for the militarization plan that had been drawn up by NSC 68. NSC 68 was a National Security Council policy paper that called for the remarkable expansion of the U.S. military budget. Naturally, the CPD counted among its members many representatives of defense contracting companies, a field that, as noted above, with the case of Crown Hoy and General Dynamics, was becoming increasingly infiltrated by elements of organized. The organizers behind this California group, CPD, were the movie producer Samuel Goldwyn and industrialist Floyd Oldham. Oldham, shadowy figure who is now largely forgotten, was the man behind the towering Atlas Corporation through which he invested heavily into a vast array of aviation companies, film studios, real estate and natural resources. Atlas Corporation would later gain lucrative government contracts, in particular for its interest in uranium mining inside the United States, and abroad's interests were certainly diverse through Atlas. His money seeped into Hilton Hotels, into the United Fruit Company and into Pan Am. Atlas also controlled Convair, the aircraft manufacturer and defense contractor, which it sold to General Dynamics in 1953 as part of the deal. Atlas received large amounts of General Dynamics stock, and a representative on the company's board owed Lemon Harry Crown, in other words, were directly other associates of the California group backing the formation of the CPD were a number of film industry figures, including future President Ronald Reagan. Reagan was an MCA man through and through, having been represented by the company when it bought out the agency that had previously represented him in 1940. Based on the success of Kings Row in 1942, wrote Dan Aldier in his book on MCA, Dark Victory, Lou Wasserman renegotiated Reagan's contract with Warner Brothers, obtaining a deal that paid Reagan $3,500 a week for 7 years. The deal gave Reagan the distinction of being Wasserman's first $1 million. As will be noted again in Chapter 10, the rise of Reagan to the heights of political power in the United States was facilitated in large part by Wasserman and MCA. At the same time, Reagan was vital to the survival and success of MCA in Hollywood. At the behest of Wasserman, Reagan ran for and won the presidency of the powerful Screen Actors. At the time, Reagan was also acting as an FBI informant, reporting to the Bureau on Leftists in Hollywood. Once in charge of the SAG, Reagan began to change the rules to benefit his benefactors. SAG had previously restricted companies like MCA, that is talent agencies, from becoming producers. However, in 1952, Reagan Granted, the company is special. MCA thus gained an insurmountable edge over competing agencies in Hollywood and began to exponentially increase its hold over the entertainment industry. Later, when Reagan secured the governorship of California in 1966, MCA's hidden hand was again lurking in the background. The co-chairman of his campaign was Taft Stryper, the long-running vice president of while the company's founder, Jules Stein, went to work arranging for. According to Moldier, a standing joke in Hollywood was that MCA even had its own governor. MCA had actually hedged its bets in that election. Running against Reagan was the incumbent, Pat Brown, who was being backed by Wasserman and Korshik. Henry Denker, a playwright and producer with numerous Hollywood connections, stated that MCA was divided into two groups. There was a Democratic group and the Republican group. They always wanted to have a hand in the White House, no matter which party was there. When Reagan was doing the General Electric show, somebody came up with the idea that he would promote GE to the plants, make visits. These appearances were very successful. They saw how the workers loved him. And somebody at MCA said, "Hey, he could be governor of the state in show business. You go with what's working." That's an old maxim. After being defeated by Reagan, Pat Brown took a directorship at Investors Overseas Services, IOS, an international mutual fund, with connections to Meyer Lansky. He had been brought to the fund by James Roosevelt, one of the sons of former President Franklin D. Roosevelt. James, it seems, had organized crimes, ties of his own, as he had done business with Store Properties, the mob-controlled real estate company that had been set up by Zifrin and J. Also partnered alongside Roosevelt and Store Properties with James Swig, who would serve earlier as Pat Brown's statewide finance chairman in his successful California gubernatorial campaign. The Roosevelt boys seemed to have a penchant for fostering ties to the underworld. James's brother, John Roosevelt, had arranged for Jimmy Hoffa to get a job at Back & Company, a New York City securities and stock brokerage that handled about 25% of the Teamster Pensions Fund's $160 million invest. The president of Back & Company, incidentally, was Frank D. Ryan, a veteran of the OSS who was partnered with the spy master William Donovan, and other veterans of U.S. and British wartime intelligence in the World Commerce Corporation. CWC itself was capitalized by a handful of firms, including Back & Company itself, and Floyd Oldham's Atlas Corporation, which was represented on the WCC board by Oldham's brother-in-law L. Boyd Hatch. With this set of ties, the specter of intelligence connections begins to emerge once again. It is no surprise, then, that there is a direct line running from the Chicago-Los Angeles supermob to the networks that were simultaneous.